My name is Jaya Lala, and I'm the Senior Global Education Manager at UNA-NCA. I manage the Global Classrooms DC program, which is the flagship education program of the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area, which means I get to interact with people like Maria and our colleagues at the IOM to bring things to life like this webinar and our following a virtual Model UN session on Friday to life for all of you. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Maria today. She is going to be our main speaker. She's representing on behalf of the IOM. Maria Moreno currently serves as the head of operations of IOM's nonprofit arm in the United States, USA for IOM. She has extensive experience working with the US private sector to support IOM programs worldwide. Private sector counterparts include individuals, celebrities, diaspora, corporate leaders, and foundation managers. She's led numerous donor appeal efforts to assist vulnerable migrants around the world caught in humanitarian emergencies, such as the more than 150,000 Ethiopian migrants returned from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the migration emergency in the Mediterranean, and natural disasters such as the recent hurricanes in the Caribbean. She also serves as IOM's liaison with the Organization of American States, or the OAS, and the Inter-American Development Bank, or the IDB, both headquartered in Washington, D.C. Prior to her work at IOM, Maria was a migration policy officer at the OAS, where she co-authored the report, International Migration in the Americas, published in 2011 and 2012, jointly with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. She's a lawyer concentrating on international law and international relations, and she earned her dual law degree from the Universidad Privada de Santa Cruz de la Sierra Bolivia and Universidad del Belgrano in Buenos Aires, Argentina. With that, thank you so much to Maria for doing this for us today, and I will take it over to you.
Thank you, Dea, for that kind introduction. I know that it's a lot of titles and things to do, but I just wanted to add to that curriculum that I had done many Model UNs from high school to during, in the university and after when I was an intern. So I am very happy to be here. I'm very happy to share what I can and what I know and make it an interesting conversation about migration, human mobility, and everything that it's people on the move. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, go ahead, Maria.
Okay, so we want to get started. Okay, so welcome to this wonderful group of students. Thank you for joining me today. I just want to make this as conversational as possible. I want to share with you some knowledge later through the questions that are going to be made to me. But first, I want to know, either through the chat or through your hands raised, if someone wants to unmute and tell me a definition about migration. Does someone can venture to give me a definition about migration? In the chat. Don't be shy, don't be shy. I'm not seeing.
Yeah, you are all welcome to unmute. Just tell us what you know about migration, and there's no wrong answers.
I see Kelly Johnson.
Migration is the movement of people from one location to another.
Great. Great, I'm seeing moving from one place to another. Yes. Moving from one place to another, either voluntarily or because of other pressures like politics. This is a great answer, or economics. That's great. Moving from one place to another. I have someone with a camera on. Please, Steve.
Yeah, I guess there's forced migration where people have circumstances in where they're coming from that they can't stay there anymore for whatever reason. And then there's more voluntary migration where people are moving to another place to just get a new opportunity or something, but not necessarily because they're being forced out of where they're coming from.
Fantastic, great. I'll take one more, and then we're going to go to a definition that will combine both of the answers that I have received so far. Does anybody else want to join a little bit more on more definition? Okay. Well, so I think all of those answers were great. And it's something that I wanted to share with you today, because this will kind of set the context to what we're going to be discussing in depth today and through the breakouts. And this is the definition of mixed flows. So you've defined, some of you have said migration is moving. It's correct. It's moving either internally within a country, that's called internal displacement, or is migrating from one country to another, that's international migration. And then we're talking about, you also defined voluntarily, you also said that people are forced to move given the conditions. That's what we call push factors. In migration, we have 8 or 9 drivers of migration that we use to define migration, and there are pull factors. So that means what are those factors that make migrants, migrate, bring immigration, and what are the push factors that send migrants out of the place where they live. And just to give an example of pull factors, we talk a lot about family reunification. So when family leaves in another country, that's a huge pull factor to bring your family together with you, because you want to reunite with them. A push factor, it's poverty, conflict, persecution, and everything that makes a migrant leave their place of origin. But going to what I wanted to show today is something that is very close to us, that it's happening right around the corner, and it's the Venezuelan displacement. It's the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, that it's a very clear example of what we in the international community call migration, mixed migration flows. And I would like you to take note of this definition, and you can of course find it online, and later on as you prepare for your model UN, for the simulation, but also as you prepare to be the position of your country. One thing to understand is that the Venezuelan is particularly complex because it has mixed migration flows. These are defined as complex population movements that include refugees, asylum seekers, economic migrants, and other migrants. So it's a mix of voluntarily and involuntary migration. It's a mix of people that qualify under the 1951 convention to become refugees and acquire the asylum status in another country. But there are also migrants that don't qualify under the 1951 convention. So all of this makes it more complicated, and that's why we call it mixed migration flows. In these flows, becomes even more complicated because we have unaccompanied minors, we have environmental migrants, we have smuggled persons that are at risk of becoming victims of trafficking, and stranded migrants, among many other categories. So the complexity of the crisis is just as huge as the response has to be to address all of these matters. So I want you to take note of what is a mixed migration flow, so that we can talk about it in the breakout groups and see after we kind of run the show. If you have any questions for me after your discussions in the groups, please feel free to write those in the chat. We can address them at the end. And also, I want to hear from you what you bring from your groups, so we can share and have a conversation. This is not a one-way. Jay, am I on time? Is that correct? Okay, great. So I think that the best way to provide an overview of the Venezuela is to play this video that we have prepared today. and it will highlight the magnitude. It's the second largest displacement of people in the world currently after the Syrian crisis. It's right in our around the corner in the South America, and it's also the largest movement of people in the modern history of Latin America and the Caribbean. So Jaya, please, if you can go ahead and play the video. Thank you.
Yes, of course. Give me 1 second.
En esta situación de pandemia nos las hemos visto feas.
Se nos dificultó a partir del anuncio del brote de la pandemia. Mi esposo no pudo asistir a la cita para la solicitud de la cédula. Entonces ya eso por ahí repercute en otros temas, principalalmente laboral.
Vivo es del día a día trabajando de informal en la calle, vendiendo mis cositas. Y ya tengo meses desde que empezó la cuarentena, no tengo absolutamente nada de eso.
Lo que yo más quisiera es que mis hijos no tuvieran que estar en la calle, no pasaran trabajo. Y si uno no tuviera hijos, tal vez uno aguantaría, pero con hijos no se es fuerte, ¿verdad? Estar así.
Muchos venezolanos nos han cerrado las puertas, de verdad es muy bueno que nos estén atendiendo porque sin este centro de atención muchas personas no estuvieran atendidas.
Esta pandemia nos hizo darnos cuenta de que todos somos vulnerables y que estamos en la misma barca.
Cuando el ser humano llega a ti, es porque realmente le está necesitando de tu atendimiento, está necesitando de tu ayuda.
Durante el proceso de cuarentena hemos visto que ha generado ansiedad, estrés en la población. Es por eso que vamos desarrollando estas actividades.
¿Y qué más satisfactorio que tú puedas ayudar a esa persona?
Nosso trabalho é essencial, já que a gente trabalha com pessoas que estão em situação de vulnerabilidade.
Great. Thank you, Jaya, for putting that video on and really framing the conversation as to what are we going to talk about today. But maybe before going into the breakouts, maybe we want to start knowing a little bit more of IOM. Do you want to go ahead and do that Q&A first?
Yes, we can definitely start off there. So just to ask, what is IOM? What do you do?
Great, thank you. So IOM is the largest UN agency of dealing with migration and everything that it's about, people on the move. It's the International Organization for Migration. We work to help ensure that orderly and humane management of migration is carried out amongst, the countries that are part of our organization. More than 170 countries are member states. We promote international cooperation on migration issues, and we assist governments and member states in the search for practical solutions to migration. We don't want to call migration problems. We talk about migration phenomenon, and how do countries manage migration in a way that they can benefit from its opportunities by overcoming its challenges. We provide humanitarian assistance, like the example of the Venezuelan displacement, and we look for solutions all the time next to the governments, accompanying the governments in finding ways that we can address the challenges, for example, of access to education, access to healthcare, access to socioeconomic integration. What happens with migrants that arrive to these countries? In the case of Venezuelans, are they going to be able to have a livelihood and have an income generation activity that will contribute both to the desire of living a better life, but also to the development, the economic development of the country, and contributing to the community that they work? So all of this, it's a lot of words just to say IOM accompanies governments in the search for practical solutions to migration. And that's what we do. In this example, and I want to refer to the video all the time, so we make it about, this particular example. It's a very interesting collaboration that we have been able to develop with the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. It's a very commendable collaboration that was entrusted by the Secretary General in 2018, when he called the UN Refugee Agency and the UN Migration Agency to collaborate and address this Venezuelan displacement crisis. It's IOM and UNHCR work in many countries and in many humanitarian responses together. But I think the Venezuela response is one of the leading examples of the UN collaboration, interagency collaboration, where we are coordinating a $1.4 billion response per year with more than 150 local NGOs. So it's really great what we are, what the UN system can bring as part of solutions for human mobility challenges.
Yeah, and I think especially with the pandemic going on, and I'm sure you'll touch on this a little bit later, that these issues have come to the forefront of our society. So we've really seen over the last year how much, migrants go through, how much refugees have to go through, and how what's going on in the world really affects that. Next question is, where does IOM work? And along that, how does IOM prioritize which areas to focus on?
Yeah. IOM has, as I said, more than 173 member states, and we work where we are invited to work. So we are partners. We work in partnership with the governments, but the guiding principles of IOM are, of course, its charter and promoting orderly and humane migration. But the priorities and the strategies to address that is in our charter comes from what we want to accomplish right now by 2030. And the Sustainable Development Agenda through the Sustainable Development Goals and the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. Our current priorities are three. So it's one, resilience. Number two is mobility. And the third one is governance. And I could go a little bit more into this, but I think that it is important that as you prepare to look at your priorities as governments, as member states yourself, you always remember that if you are debating or talking about migration, you need to focus on the Sustainable Development Goals and what the position is your country towards that. What is the position of your country towards the Global Compact of Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration? A clear example is the United States, and how do you frame your position as country in these three thematic priorities that I just mentioned? Is your country working towards prioritizing resilience of migrants, either your migrants that are in another country or migrants that are in your host government. If you promote mobility, what are the principles for mobility, and what are the conditions that you require as a country for promoting migration? And governance is, how do you make sure that there is a process and a framework, a legal framework that will provide that umbrella for migration to happen within your country or inter-countries.
And then how does all of that work come together under your role at IOM?
My role at IOM is a very nice, very nice job. It gives me the opportunity of doing things like this, but also talking to people that are not really connected to migration in a formal way. Let's say they're not knowledgeable of migration processes, but are keen to support migration, and this is a private sector. So I work with generous American people that want to contribute to IOM's response, either if it's humanitarian, emergency, conflict, if it's long-term solutions, if it's about climate change, if it's 100 million ways of partnering with the private sector. Currently, I am very happy to have been able to work with celebrities, from football players to NFL players to singers like Madonna, where I see their interest in even if they don't know how all of this happens, they just want to help. And my voice is the one that it's able to make that match and say, this is the need we have right now, and this is your desire to help. So how do we make the most out of what you can give us? So basically, I have a team of people of staff members in USA for IOM that dedicated specifically in different topics. So some of them work for bringing partners that are more interested in protection and counter trafficking initiatives. Another staff is more interested, is tasked to go after partners that are interested in supporting resilience, adaptation, under the umbrella of climate migration. What do we do to prepare the Caribbean islands to face the hurricane season? What do we do to build back better? And what is the private sector role on that? So that is what I do in IOM.
Yeah, it definitely seems like a very all-encompassing role. And you touched on this a little bit in your answer as well as in the beginning, but what kind of assistance, services, and work does IOM actually do?
Yeah, so what we do is, as I said, it's part of supporting governments in the way they want to manage migration. If we see that they need a little bit of support in that definition of priorities or how to address any challenge that it's going on, because IOM has this portfolio and of compilation of best practices around the world, and sometimes from region to region solutions are similar because of the context, because of the socio-political economic landscape of the country. Solutions can be adapted from one country to another. So that's what IOM does from the policy side. From the humanitarian response, for example, IOM, we are proud to say that we are one of the most, the quickest UN agencies to be on the ground on the onset of a natural disaster, for example. Why disaster? Because when there is a natural disaster, there is displacement and communities are displaced. Entire communities are searching for water after an earthquake, for potable water. What happens? What IOM does is within 2 hours of receiving an invitation from the government where the natural disaster struck, IOM is there. And we are the lead of the UN cluster for shelter and camp management and camp coordination. That means that after the earthquake in 2015 in Nepal, IOM was leading the camps and the shelter for 55,000 displaced families in Kathmandu. So that is what IOM does all around the globe in every single part. We also sit in regional processes where countries that have similar migration challenges and opportunities, like the regional consultative processes in South America, Central America, in Africa, and Asia. They sit and they want to discuss migration from a more regional focus and perspective. So that's where IOM sits, mainly as a technical secretariat, and where we provide technical assistance.
What would you say are some of the most rewarding parts of working with IOM, and then what are some of the challenges?
Well, for me personally, the most rewarding thing is being able to see impact every single day. And I've been fortunate to being able to travel the world thanks to IOM, and being able to witness firsthand what my colleagues, what the UN staff do on the ground. And when when I transport myself, right now, when you're making that question to me, I'm right there, I'm experiencing what happens when there is an organized response, a coordinated approach to an emergency. And when you can make one person, just one single person, smile, thrive, open their new business because they were able to be supported by IOM and its donors to open a business and provide for their families. And that's where we're going in the later on, because I really want to show the face of migration from the perspective of integration, which is one of the most important work that IOM does, is promoting livelihoods, promoting income generation activities so that migrants can contribute, as I said, to their own benefit, but also to the benefit of societies that are hosting them. And how does that have an even larger impact when we talk about xenophobia, and when we see that by being able to say that a migrant is not stealing jobs, that migrants are not criminals, migrants are not bad people, it's because we need to counter that narrative with initiatives like socioeconomic and livelihood income generation activities that will show as a fact that migrants are contributing to the country of destination.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely really important, again, with the current age that we live in. We do have a couple of minutes for questions from the audience. If anyone would like to ask Maria a question, you can use the raise hand function, unmute, or just pop your question in the chat. Yep, Telsey, go ahead.
Thank you. That was a great presentation. I have a question. Does IOM or another agency work with countries that have high numbers of people kind of leaving their countries, high numbers of migration? Do they work with them to establish some of the root causes, whether it's political stability, whether it's unemployment, whether it's poor health services? Is there an arm within IOM that works with such countries so that you don't have a lot of people migrating out of the country?
Yes, that's a great question. That's a push factor, right? Poverty, insecurity, violence are push factors, and that's one of the main reasons why Central Americans leave, right? And today was announced that the Central American Paralegal program actually is going to be reopened by the Biden administration, because it was one of the solutions given to people fleeing violence. but not related to that. I just wanted to give that so that if there's any preparation for your positions as countries, maybe you should take into account the latest news. IOM does work through these regional consultative processes that I was talking about. These are non-binding consultative processes where countries really speak about this, right, and where they bring their issues of concern, and in particular the Caribbean. The Caribbean is a region that has what we don't call anymore like the brain drain. And we talk a lot more about brain circulation. But one of the huge concerns of Caribbean islands is that they're losing their nurses, they're losing their medical practitioners, they're losing, highly qualified professionals because of, the lack of jobs, the lack of access, the lack of other situations. So definitely this is addressed mainly in regional processes, and part of the Sustainable Development Goals is to address all of this. The sustainable agenda is through the goals to address these challenges that will, that reduce inequalities, like 10.1, which is one of the main reasons why people flee, to protection, climate change, economic opportunities. So through the goals and through all of that comes, after those goals, is that we are trying to find solutions to these challenges by 2030. I think we have a huge challenge ourselves of meeting those by 2030, in particular because we've been through this pandemic on 2020, we're 2021 still going on. There is going to be a delay, but that's one of the we're thriving to do that by 2030.
Letizia, go ahead.
I want to understand what you do if immigrants enter another poor country. And I know that sometimes, for example, Venezuela and Colombia isn't the richest and they don't handle their borders very well. Sorry. So, So how would you deal with that? For example, crime rates go up. There's a lot of people on the streets begging for food, entering houses. How would you deal with criminals and all that?
Sorry, I was mute. IOM doesn't deal with those because those are internal matters that the countries have the sovereignty to address them. What we do is, thanks to our international community support, our donors, is try to kind of find a unified response to support countries that will be in the need to receive all of this inflow of migrants. For example, the Venezuela Refugee and Migrant Response Plan, which I really encourage you to learn and read and share as much as I wish we have more info sheets and things to share with you, but it's very interesting what you will find there, especially in preparation for your model UN. What we try to do is to look at 17 countries in Latin America that are receiving high numbers of Venezuelan migrants, that are countries that are not necessarily high income, countries like Bolivia, Colombia, Uruguay that has a population of 3 million, where you have, countries like Trinidad and Tobago receiving 10% of their population in Venezuelans. So yes, your question is very valid. What we do is the international community stands up and we support countries. And what we're doing right now is trying to support 17 countries across Latin America and the Caribbean so they can thrive with this migration inflow.
Thank you, Maria. We're going to take just one more question, and if we are unable to answer your question, just go ahead and pop it in the chat and we'll try to get to it at the end. But Anwen, I hope I am pronouncing your name correctly. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, you did. Thank you. I know it's a hard name, so I appreciate it. I was just wondering, so you were talking earlier about like migrants and refugees, and the video we were watching also used both the words migrant and refugee. And obviously there's a legal definition that are different for those two, but in your experience being on the ground, do you see a difference between these people who are defined as migrant versus refugee? And when we're talking about immigration and migration, how do we use these terms in order to respect people's journey and their experiences?
Wow. I mean, that's a great question. And thank you for, I'm so happy and proud to be here because I wish more people were making themselves the same questions. We, at the moment of an emergency, we're in a response. We're not asking anybody what's your status or, not even your nationality. We will address any response regardless of their immigration status. There are processes that happen at borders, and there are survey points where we need to make this categorization between refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants, because we need to know how to address their different needs. A refugee or an asylum seeker will have different, because of the regulations in each country, will have different accesses. So we need to know how to direct them to the appropriate, the appropriate mechanisms. So that's the only reason why we survey this information, because we need to know what are the vulnerabilities. Some of them are not only qualified or can qualify for a refugee status, but are also victims of trafficking. So there is a mixed flow. Where can they seek assistance or attention, given that they will claim their status, but also need to get assistance. So all of this is a very complex situation, but I'm very glad to say that there are processes and what we call SOPs in our operations, standards of procedure, so that they can be addressed. For us, for IOM, we define refugees and asylum seekers are part of migrants. We include them in our definition of migration, because migration is movement, as many of you said, and a refugee, in order to claim their status in a second country and then possibly a third country through resettlement, they need to move. And that's why we consider them under the migration category. Now, every time that you refer to a migrant, we just need to not forget that they are persons and they have human rights. And that is the best thing you can do when addressing migrants or refugees, regardless of what their status is that they have human rights.
All right, well, thank you all for your questions. Again, if we did not get to your question, please pop it in the chat and we'll try our best to answer it during the rest of the webinar. What I'm going to do now is, based on the video we watched on the situation in Venezuela, I'm going to put you all in breakout rooms of about 5 to 6 people each. And I'm popping a couple of questions that you all will be able to discuss in the chat. We're going to come back after about 5 minutes to discuss what you all discussed in your breakout rooms. And then we'll watch another video, talk about what's different, and then wrap up the webinar. So I'm going ahead and opening up the breakout rooms. You all should receive a notification right now to join one of the rooms, but let us know if you have any questions. All right, everyone should be back. So what did you all discuss in your breakout rooms? Let's start off with the first question. How many different people, groups, or communities were represented in the video? And what do you think is important to them? I heard a lot of activity in breakout room too, so I know you guys had some discussion. Yeah, Marcelo, go ahead.
So in our group, we talked about the intersectionality between different groups and how that increases the vulnerabilities. So if you consider migrants and refugees, you also have to consider people with disabilities or women and children, or in the case of people that have a specific chronic conditions and diseases that they need a specific, they have needs, and all of these things compound over each other. And the case gets much worse when you're talking about migrants and refugees.
Yeah, Letizia.
We talked about the pros and cons of immigrants moving into, well, a new country.
And what about the second question? What do you think these populations want most in their situation?
Well, I think in the first place, like no one wants to have to leave their homeland. Like people are already in a really dire situation if they're having to leave somewhere that they feel it's home, that they have so many memories that they really cherish. And so obviously, I mean, I think that like their highest hopes would be able to return to this place that they've called home for so long. But I think at the end of the day, they really just want to be able to be safe and to have a place where they're not having to worry about what they're going to eat, where they're going to get healthcare, if they're going to be in a safe situation without violence. And so I think there are so many different levels of what these people want. There are these kind of their wildest dreams of, you know, wanting to go back, but then also just the simplest basic needs of wanting to be safe and wanting to be able to have the basic necessities that we all count on, and that for many of us we take for granted.
Yeah, absolutely. Maria, did you want to add anything else?
Yeah, I am so proud of everything that you have said, all of you. I have been in that bridge that it's in the Simón Bolívar bridge, that it's the border between Venezuela and Colombia. And I can tell you, you know, how overwhelming it is to see all of this, you know, massive numbers of people just crossing the bridge by foot, just, you know, one handbag or a luggage, piece of luggage, without destination, right? Without knowing where they're going. And bringing in those bags just, you know, just a couple things that will, you know, not material things, but what I'm talking about, their bags are their disabilities, their vulnerabilities, bringing with them what will possibly be the reason of, or the cause for being, how do you say, discriminated in the country where they are. If they are, you know, different from the people where they are going to be. So if LGBTI communities, people with disabilities, the elderly, children that won't have access to education just because they have their migratory status. And that kind of overwhelming situations is just what it brings the need, you know, it makes the need to have discussions like the one we're having today, because I'm sure that the world is not going to get any better. Unfortunately, we're trying to do that, but you will face similar challenges when you are the ones making decisions on behalf of your country. So this is why it's important to have these conversations, because the questions that I hope that you keep those questions and the views that you're having today when you are in charge and when you are representatives in different sectors. It doesn't have to be the government. It can be the private sector, it can be civil society. But from wherever you are, just remember what you learned and during these times. So yeah, that was, I just wanted to share that. And one thing that Anwin, she said about people want to go back home, that is true. But there are many, many migrants that want to stay where they were received, because they also find that place as their new home. So how do we work on policies that will help migrants fully integrate into those societies? And how do we help them become really citizens of that country where they are accepted, where they are integrated, and where they feel happy? But also when I see migrants that want to return home, but they can't because of the situation in their country, I ask Syrians in Iraq, I ask them in Turkey, they want to go back home. They didn't leave because they wanted to, they just had to. So that's something that we also have to keep in mind when we are discussing policies, is we're not talking about people that just want to stay forever in a country. They want to go back home. So how do we help them rebuild their homes so they can go back safely?
Yeah, thank you so much, Maria. So I'm going to go ahead and play a video about Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago. We'll have a little discussion about that video as well. And while we're watching that, I'm popping a question in the chat that I want you all to
Mi nombre es Darbelis Blanco, soy de Caracas, Venezuela y tengo 37 años de edad. Bueno, llegué aquí a Trinidad un 31 de julio del 2017. Estoy agradecida con lo que tengo, porque cuando llegué a vivir en un cuartico como con 5 o 6 personas y bueno, poco a poco se han ido logrando avances. Nos pusimos a hacer carteras reversibles, nos pusimos a hacer cositas, pero para que la gente viera que aquí sí estaba funcionando un negocio de costura. Ya la gente aquí me conoce como la costurera del barrio. Pero sí creo que hay organizaciones como IOM, como TTV Solnet y muchas otras organizaciones que están trabajando para que los venezolanos que sepamos hacer cosas con nuestras manos podamos tener algún proyecto de autosustento, porque es lo que más queremos. Yo me puedo sentar aquí a decirte todas las necesidades que tengo. Mis hijos no tienen zapatos, por ejemplo, ahorita, pero es que eso no es lo que yo quiero, porque realmente necesitamos una necesidad de seguridad. Que yo pueda decir, mira, voy a montar un negocio aquí porque con esto yo me voy a autosustentar y voy a sustentar mi familia, las necesidades básicas, comida, colegio, renta, y voy a estar tranquila, trabajando mucho, matándome 12, 16 horas al día, pero sabiendo que el día de mañana voy a estar mejor y que mis hijos lo van a estar.
So looking at that video and at the question in the chat, how do you think COVID-19 has impacted migrants and host communities? Feel free to raise your hand or write something in the chat. Yeah, Madison, go ahead.
I think that because of the pandemic, it has put a little bit of more strain and stress onto migrants and refugees, because one, they might not be getting as much help as they need. And in this time, it will be very much more difficult to get the things you need because it's becoming more and more scarce as the pandemic goes on. And I feel as if the IOM has impacted them so that they can get the things that they need throughout all of this without having to worry about what's going to happen next, or if they're going to have to move again, or if they're going to leave their family behind. It's like that state of reassurance that the IOM provides them, and that they are okay. So I think that makes them feel as if the pandemic is just something that they are going to be able to get through with the IOM's help.
Anwen, go ahead.
Well, this isn't directly related to Venezuela, but my nonprofit works in Uganda, and every week because of COVID, the major aid programs there are that help refugees. We work in the biggest refugee settlement there, and they're pulling about $200,000 of aid each week. And so we're losing that because of the pandemic. And There are so many issues because hospitals are filling up with COVID patients, and a lot of women become pregnant because they don't have access to birth control, don't want to use birth control through sexual assault. And so you're seeing a lot of people, a lot of women especially, having more health concerns, not having access to hospitals, and then not having access to the resources that they normally have access to because all of these major aid companies are pulling hundreds of thousands of dollars a week from these places. And what I've seen especially is we don't see these happening to white refugees. We see these in places where there are refugees of color. And so there's definitely also this racial discrepancy that is occurring as well with the pandemic.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'll take one more person before we start getting into our concluding thoughts. Someone who hasn't spoken yet. And I will call on you if you haven't spoken. Samantha, what about you? Oh, sorry.
I have a question, maybe we'll pop out some reactions. What do you think about migrants that have been the motors of the economy during the pandemic? What kind of jobs do you think that migrants have taken during the pandemic? Related or unrelated, they can comment.
Yeah, Samantha, go ahead.
I think a lot of people have probably had to take on temporary labor. There's not a lot of stable jobs that people are able to take on right now. So when you do see people taking jobs, they're usually things that are either informal or are only going to last for a short amount of time.
Anyone else before we start getting into our concluding thoughts?
I do want to add this. So what we have seen in IOM, despite all the restrictions that have really impacted migration, right? Because migration is going to happen regardless of COVID. The lockdown and the border closings at one point where I think we had 200 borders closed and more than 600 restrictions about mobility in the world. The countries imposed. But the reality is that migration still happens. It just happens in an even more vulnerable way, because instead of taking a regular path, or where I would have crossed the border through the border control, right? If I'm going through a free circulation countries, it just happens and you kind of fall under the smugglers, and then that's where you could become a victim of smuggling or a victim of trafficking, where because of your need of getting from point A to point B makes you vulnerable and susceptible to accept the kind of offers that smugglers and traffickers would use. So what we have seen is an increase in protection needs and all regarded to restriction. But to the point of the question, we've also seen that migrants were in manufacturing jobs, working on creating PPE for healthcare workers. Migrants were the ones that didn't leave their jobs at factories so we can have a mask, or so we can have a gown, or anything, that it's migrants' hands. Those were the Uber drivers, the Lyft drivers, the Uber Eats, migrants that risked their lives when we didn't know even what, COVID-19 meant, in early March last year. People didn't stop working because we have needs. The delivery drivers, everything that we were served. I'm not saying 100% of them are migrants, but a very, very good amount of them were migrants, because host population, host communities didn't want to take the risk, and they have different protection mechanisms. They could apply for unemployment, right? So necessity also makes opportunity, and we've seen a lot of those stories through migrants during the pandemic. So we should be thankful to that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much, Maria, and to the rest of the IOM team that's here. I'm going to launch a poll while we're kind of giving concluding thoughts, but I hope you found this webinar interesting and informative, and especially relevant for our spring conference topic on migration and mobility, to give you a good baseline. We will be having our virtual Model UN session on Friday. That'll give you a good introduction of the topic at hand, give you a good taste of what our spring conference topic is going to look like. But if you have any questions for us at the GCDC team in the meantime, you can email us directly at gcdc@unanca.org, also popping that in the chat. But thank you all for joining us today. Again, thank you to the IOM team for hosting this session with us. But once you answer the poll questions, you can go ahead and log off. Thank you so much.